Heavy sound, smoke, steam, and body funk from the Midwest. Grand funk, a bruising, blasting, electric vibration is a railroad for its generation, and running like a clockwork orange, right on its time. What is the actual story behind the biggest American rock group of all time? What has made gold records out of all the band's albums? Over 1.5 million of E Pluribus Funk, their sixth to date, going in just a few short months. What is there to say about a trio that acts like an atomic magnet on the incredibly fringe, sometimes riotous, and always record-breaking crowds it attracts everywhere it gigs all over the world? Yet what explains the simultaneous non-attraction of the press? Who or what is responsible for this media relationship as distant between the parties as the long road Grand Funk has come in its 2 short yet triumphant years? How does one account for their amazing financial and popular success in such a short period of time? Who are they? How did they get here? What makes them so controversial? As rapid as their rise has been, success on their present scale did not come immediately to Mark Farner, Don Brewer, Mel Shasher, or their producer-manager, in many ways key associate, if not downright captain, Terry Knight. Sometime in the middle of the 1960s, Terry Knight, at the age of 20, suddenly found himself to be a big-time disc jockey, making $25,000 a year in Detroit. With equal suddenness, he found himself released and out on the street, where he discovered that he himself had an ambition to be a rock star. Hip to himself, Terry Knight set out to found his own band, and did. The group he formed was known as Terry Knight and the Pack. It received a measure of renown around the Michigan area, but unfortunately in not too many other areas. Among its members were, of course, Terry himself, Don Brewer, and for a short time, Mark, who worked as a substitute bassist. Terry eventually abandoned the Pack to seek his fortune in New York. With Knight gone, the group groped through a number of changes. One of these involved the addition of Mel Shasher, who'd for a time been playing for a group called Question Mark and the Mysterians. Although you may remember the group for a big hit the group produced called 96 Tears, Mel is reluctant to talk about that and other early experiences. As he puts it, all of us knocked around in nothing bands then. None of that matters now. We all know how difficult it is for a new band to find an identity, a message, its own sound groove. It will struggle. There will be arguments over style and content. Many directions will be taken before a single road is stamped out and all the major experimenting ended. Grand Funk's beginnings represent no exception to the rule. In fact, the group's origins might be termed even more muddled, since an unusually large number of musicians came and went before the basic formula on which future success was to be banked was decided on. So out of all this shuffling internal to Terry Knight's old group emerged the nucleus of the present Grand Funk. Only at that time, Mark, Mel, and Don called themselves the Fabulous Pack. The band still hadn't found itself in the winter of 1969, unless by that you mean finding yourself in New England without any money, which is exactly what happened to the Fabulous Pack. They were forced to sell their instruments for bread in order to get home, and when they got back, John put in a historic phone call to Terry Knight asking for help. We can only suppose that it was a karmic combination of fate and intuition that made the boys think of reuniting with their former leader. Terry Knight is one hard cat to forget once he gets stamped on that photo plate in the back of your mind. Putting the heavy fate trip aside for a moment, there was a lot of good sound logic in the boys' decision. Knight was older, had been around, was a good strong leader, which the foundering band needed, and basically he understood how to protect his interests. In every way, the return of Terry Knight heralded completion to the mixture needed for success. The last missing ingredient was added, and the phenomenal bubbling alchemy that was to froth his funk set in motion when sorcerer Terry Knight signed on to produce and manage Mark, Mel, and Don. The town of Flint is just north of Detroit in Michigan. It's populated mostly with factory workers from General Motors' enormous Buick and Chevrolet plants. It is from here that the boys, Terry Knight included, hail. All are in their early 20s, with the exception of Knight, who is 28. Quite young ages for success of the magnitude they have experienced. In fact, pretty young for any kind of success, if not too young. Yet all the boys' good fortune has not gone to their heads. They are not snobs, arrogant, or as a friend of Mark says, on ego trips like other musicians in rock are. They're not like the Beatles were. So, how are they? Now, 2 years after having to travel to Atlanta for the pop festival in a rented Volkswagen van, they continue to travel, only by airplane, and continue to rap about the revolution with all the brothers and sisters in the audience. All this when at the same time the band is an incorporated $20 million enterprise. Don Brewer is the wildly popular drummer with a jungle-dense frizzy hair, the exuberant, vibrant, non-stop rhythm machine setting beat background for the heavy electric energy up front, and author of those incredible extended free solos set winging in such cuts as TNUC. He's 22 and lives at home with his mother. Don receives a moderately large allowance from the Grand Funk Corporation, and his birth sign is Pisces. Mark Farner, the out-of-sight guitarist with straight blonde hair almost down to the tough armband he wears around his bicep, has a lot of raw appeal. Maybe this is because of his frequent predilection for dancing on stage without wearing a shirt. He really knows how to shake that half-naked muscular torso and those golden locks for full effect in front of that huge, wild, screeching assemblage of brothers and sisters. Mark writes most of the group's lyrics and resides on a horse ranch on the outskirts of Flint. He's very seriously interested and concerned with ecological issues. He rides a motorcycle instead of an automobile. He feels it pollutes the air less. Mark performs most of the band's works on vocals, and he was born under the sign of Libra. More about his involvement with ecology later. Mel Shasher is the group's bassist, born under the sign of Aries. Quiet and thoughtful, Mel's face communicates a great deal less moroseness, although it is really dark and intense, than do the tough, foreboding photos of him carrying an axe as he is shown on the Gimme Shelter album. In addition to the pickaxe, Mel is seen dressed in fur and standing in a cave. The overall effect is pretty menacing. Shasher is really unbelievably skinny. He has a waist size of 22 inches according to Terry Knight. When he performs in front of those huge amps on stage, vibrating so fast with all that power steering through his slight build, almost blurring him out of focus, his audience effect, like the energy he uses so well, is electric. Mel, possibly expressing the whole band's feelings about music, explains the sharp contrast between his ferocious on-stage and his tamer, far more personable off-stage manner on the grounds that performing satisfies a powerful need for energy release. To retreat from the crowds and to obtain more privacy, as everyone, even rock stars, must, Mel likes to spend his own time in the basement of his own home, where the walls are completely paneled with shelves holding stereo equipment and hundreds of long-playing records, along with Mel's own public address system. Shasher spends a great deal of time at home and everywhere else with his girlfriend, Dina, who at one time was only a fan. Dina's dream-come-true relationship with her idol began in St. Louis, where the pair met following a gig by Funk. Dina describes the soft waterbed in Mel's basement room as a comfortable place to relax. It's as obvious as the mustache on Frank Zappa's face that the tenor of the group's triumphs has not appreciably affected the modest, down-to-earth quality of the boys' lives. Yet the extraordinary indifference of Grand Funk's musicians to success is compensated for by the driving energy, brutal frankness, and overwhelming promotional genius of Terry Knight. Terry's ability to handle all of the aspects of travel, advertising, recording, press releases, more about this later, recording contracts, and business in general compensates for the boys' own dislike of business involvement and enables the musicians to spend much more of their time thinking and planning new music, as musicians are to anyway. Terry gives the Grand Funk Railroad enterprise a fine balance in the overall structure of what it's all about. And Grand Funk is as surely about more than just music as there is more to Raquel Welch than her just being an actress. More about this later, too. To understand the railroad means to a large extent to understand its promoter, this man, Terry Knight, his own personal philosophy of life, and what he thinks Grand Funk is all about. We can only imagine what this experience, this celestial taste of success had done to him. When Terry Knight fell as a disc jockey and then as a performer, he became only that much more determined to climb back up, all the way back up to the top, even if it was going to have to be in the role of the power behind the throne. You might say that the kick is akin to being like a Secretary of State Dulles to an Eisenhower, or today, a Henry Kissinger to a President Nixon. Not that Terry Knight thinks that the throne, undisputedly occupied by rock's reigning kings, the Grand Funk Railroad, is more rightfully his own than Mark, Mel, or Don's. Quite the contrary. Knight is a dean of modesty with respect to his contribution to the band's winning sound, where some critics have gone even so far as to suggest that Terry Knight writes some, if not all, of the group's material, or choreograph how it is arranged and performed. He angrily and quickly moves to debunk this kind of talk as nonsense. Terry will be just as ready and likely to launch himself on a long philosophical discourse about the prophetic message the boys, who are the spokesmen for their generation, Terry feels, brings to man. All this will be done in order to clarify his role, the function Terry feels he fulfills with the railroad in his own head, and one definitely not related to choreographing their act. The way Knight thinks about himself in relation to Grand Funk is that he is the oracle's interpreter, the medium through which his prophetic message is expressed. Knight is deeply involved with the consciousness of cosmic energy in crowds. Do you have any idea what it's like to be on stage, man? The power to make thousands of people stand on their feet and scream, he has said. It's the sort of thing you can never truly understand unless you've actually done it yourself. Terry Knight used to sing in front of some of those big crowds when he led the pack. In fact, he had a hit single which you may remember, I Who Have Nothing. Perhaps the power he was unable intuitively to find and unharness and make work for himself, Knight came to understand in a more objective way, and eventually utilized with funk. Because, man, Terry's railroad really reaches out and grabs, practically ionizes masses of people, and in the places where they are wired for it the most. Slender, intense, shaggy-haired with a beard, so humorless you can hear a pin drop to the floor, loud as a Led Zeppelin if anyone tries to make a joke anywhere in his vicinity. Terry is a formidable and very voluble spokesman indeed. An appearance of the Grand Funk Railroad, the announcement of an appearance of the Grand Funk Railroad does not announce a musical concert. It signals a convention. It hails a gathering of people. It's an exchange of thoughts and ideas. It is politics that supersedes music, according to Knight. What we have here is a quote which illustrates very beautifully an extremely astute understanding of musical power. It also says something important, incidentally, about power's relation to politics. We all know where that's at. We might already have an inkling about the manic way Terry Knight has of getting excited about something. When really interested, Terry's words come jumping and cascading like an electric waterfall, or one of Mark Farner's frenzied riffs. It doesn't take very much to get Terry going either, so he gets excited pretty often. Here's what the man has to say about music. One thing they gotta realize is that rock and roll has got nothing to do with music. I think that the press, the media, have dealt with the group in terms of their music, when the most important communication they're making to their audience is not what they're playing or singing. What is it then, this experience? Maybe that's the only thing we can call it. Is communicating, if not the simple, direct, pleasurable enjoyment of music. This sort of question surfaces every time an Elvis Presley pelvis twitch rocks a generation to life. Every time some solid, urgent beat is the sound everyone wants to hear and feel. And an epidemic of some madness such as Beatlemania starts to tidal wave a population. It can come from anywhere and usually does. America's Deep South or Liverpool, it doesn't matter. It will always be unexpected. It will always be gloriously welcome. It will always be impossible to describe because there will always be something differently unique about the sound. Critics will overreach themselves trying to put it into words and will more often than not be forced to resort to religious parallels to do it. According to Terry Knight, the man closest to the sound of Grand Funk, from the point of view of someone outside the actual sound, we get the uncharacteristically short comment, playing or singing comes second with the group, a statement which may imply either that the boys are better actors than they are musicians, or that they are some sort of spiritual beings in touch with the energy common to all their peers, and that it is like this, more than music, which Funk's audiences come to partake of and share in with each other in the celebration of a concert. A moment ago, we spoke of the need for religious or spiritual language to describe some of the feelings involved in some of the big sound experiences. Is it possible to talk about some of the things Grand Funk does up on that stage without talking about ritual? Can we describe the meaning of Mark ripping off his shirt, or Mel tearing off his vest, or stomping around with that axe without bringing up the subject of symbols? We all know that rock stars tend to be revered as gods. To what extent is that reverence justified? This is a question which terrifies many straight people. The possibility that our society's young may actually be in touch with the other world. Terry Knight says flatly, the establishment is afraid of Grand Funk Railroad. But to what extent is the audience's predisposition to idolizing stars exploited by the performers and a conscious thing to them? Or is it all just theater? There are those who seriously say that a group with 3 musicians evoke a Trinitarian power. How much of this and other similar sort of Kabbalistic speculation on rock should be explored seriously? Perhaps we will all be better able to judge on the meaning and the significance of the Grand Funk's Trinity's ritual after we listen to the following quote from Terry Knight on the Railroad's Act. What the audience is hearing and seeing is Mark holding his guitar over his head and saying, "You see this, brothers and sisters? You see me? I'm free. I own this stage. It's mine and it's yours, and we're free and you can be free." Donnie is saying it also when he holds his sticks above his head. He's not doing that consciously, saying, "These are my sticks and I'm holding them up above my head, see them?" But he holds them there and I see it. I can see Mel when he throws that bass up there like that. I can see him in front of that huge amp and his body feels. It's like a battery charger, and then he's full of that. I mean really physically full, his body charged. He blows off away from the amp and throws that bass up in the air, and the audience come right straight up with it. I think that is what the symbol of is I'm free. A free bird, I can fly, I'm a lion, I can run, I'm a human being. But I'm doing what I want and nobody can tell me not to. Steve Whaley writes for a newspaper started by Mark Farner in Flint called the Freedom Rider. Its purpose is to talk about the dream waiting for the people and the power to make it a reality, as one of Mark's own slogans, written especially for the paper goes. The tabloid represents an attempt to channel the power of funk's rock music from music into another medium. This paper also, incidentally, was one of the things Terry Knight is referring to when he spoke of an announcement of a concert of Grand Funk's heralding an exchange of thoughts and ideas, among other things. Steve, who is close to funk and a personal friend of Mark's, has this to say about the group. It doesn't really matter if their music isn't as skillful perhaps as others, it's just as real. I think it's a free experience, that's what revolution is all about. We are after the type of freedom that you can feel when you completely lose yourself at a rock concert. There is totally nothing else in your mind or head. You aren't even aware of your body. All you're aware of is electric sounds. Perhaps this is what Terry Knight was talking about when he said that rock has nothing to do with music. The power of Grand Funk seems to be in the band's ability to create a cosmically complete physical environment, an atmosphere where everything we might think of as thought and its related freedom-limiting hang-ups is totally impossible, where the body is so overloaded with electrical energy that it becomes numbed, and then acting like a spark plug on the mind, triggers off, cannonballing the mind into the bodiless state we might relate to Satori. Again, we find ourselves in the employ of the spiritual. We are caught using religious language, only this time from the East rather than the West. Yes, it's only a small wonder that where the frequency of spiritual imagery and heavy rock criticism is the greatest, where there's this tremendous volume of sound and that fuzzy, grating bass swallowing us up from the inside when it's played, the whole thing simply and best described as heavy. That's where it's found. In all likelihood, it's subject to be one which produces an atmosphere unbelievably dense, physically dense with energy. There are few groups either louder or heavier than the Grand Funk Railroad Trio. One can never truly lose the sense of wonder how just 3 people can create such shattering and awesome a volume of sound, yet have it under control, and structure it full of meaning and enjoyment. Because as anyone old enough to watch Sesame Street can tell you, it's not how much noise you make, but what kind of noise you produce. Steve Whaley mentioned the word revolution a ways back. That should be picked up on because it's important with respect to both what the group is all about and also to the lives of everyone else. We all know how today's music with a capital T, and we know that capital is Funk's recording label, pun unintended though, means freedom with a capital F. Music today is an electric joyride meant to bring us closer to home, as the third Railroad album is titled, and to a place where we are all free all the time. This is the implication of home. But music cannot keep us liberated all the time. though it can help us forget and overcome all the things wrong with the world, and even help pull us through when our own personal lives might be a drag, providing us with welcome, brief interludes of solace and joy, we know that music cannot liberate us all the time. We are aware of the fact, and to the varying extents we do something to make the world and our lives better, liberation should be a 100% of the time concern. At the famous press conference in which it was announced that Grand Funk intended to play before and fill Shea Stadium in the summer of 1971, Mark Farner also took the time to announce an intention of his own. After stating his belief in the need for nonviolent change and revolution, and conceding that change not coming from nowhere has to start small if it's going to start at all, Farner announced that he was using his own money from the corporation to buy trash cans for his hometown of Flint, Michigan, in order to make a first step towards doing something positive for health conditions, and consequently for ecology. It was a tense, in many ways hostile press conference, in which only 5 or 6 reporters showed up, astounding and angering Terry Knight, who felt that the biggest and most popular rock group in history was again being slighted by the media. According to Terry, the group has a long history of getting bad reviews, shabby coverage, and even being downrightly ignored by the press. Even at first glance, it seems true. Where are the Life magazine articles about this phenomenon? Where is the momentous appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show? Why are the talented boys' names not the household words that Ringo, John, and Paul were to become? There were dark rumors spreading that Terry Knight had, in fact, not invited all the reporters to the press conference that he might have, all for sinister reasons of his own. What actually happened, according to one reporter, was that the way the press release was written intimidated many members of the press into not wanting to come. It read, and we can judge for ourselves if this is true, or if again the press was turned off to the railroad strip. After 2 years, Grand Funk has finally consented to meet with the press. The railroad telling this himself felt intimidated by the release, yet was one of the media's representatives present for it. In any case, it is sometimes too much to hope to understand either what causes the magic in a supergroup's super appeal or every action and statement of a morose and manic genius like Terry Knight. Perhaps he was trying to dramatize the lack of concern on the part of the press for the band. This is an issue of deep concern tonight, particularly because since he already feels that the boys are spokesmen for their generation, that they very possibly might be persecuted by the establishment for exactly that reason. What we were talking about was the bad vibes at the press conference, which intimidated Farner into what Terry Knight thought was a tragic silence. Here's how Terry Knight described it. What the press failed to realize yesterday, and the tragedy is this: Mark Farner made some terribly pertinent comments. He talked about revolution. We knew they were going to ask him about revolution, which is why we wanted the press conference, so we could confront the press so they could print it, because we feel we are spokesmen for the generation. We call a press conference because we feel we represent the brothers and sisters. We call the conference so we could speak for them. We provided them with every statistic in the history of the group. We gave them every reason to be there. I can't say to the press, don't you people realize the power you have? When Mark Farner says he wants to give trash cans to the city of Flint, you ask him, what are you going to do with your money? We get another clue to the mystery surrounding the press conference and Terry's behavior with respect to it from the following quote. For years we baited the press, and I'll be the first to admit it. How do I get a press on a group that doesn't drop their pants? How do we make the headlines? It's inherent in the game, right? If we go into this to win, then we have to make headlines. I fed the press information that was true. You can't lie about attendance records. Christ, they've broken every attendance record in every city they played in the United States. You can't say to the press that Grand Funk broke attendance records and have it turn out to be a lie. It has to be the truth. We don't try to hide how much money they make. Somebody would find out. We've always been honest about it. The fact is that we fed the press information that should have been picked up as news. And so, Terry Knight's tempestuous struggle with the press goes on. He claiming that the press ignores his group's message to talk about the money they make or the trouble they cause. Which is bad, since because they are not the kind of boys who cause much trouble, they thereby fail to get as much exposure as less mature groups. something which makes it hard for them to overcome. And when Mark actually wants exposure and help from the media to start something good, like the trash can venture. The press, on the other hand, feels that Knight is trying to exploit his histrionic relations with it for publicity purposes, and, as we heard earlier, that he may insult or talk down to them condescendingly. Knight's rejoinder is, man, they don't want to know what our brothers and sisters have to say, even though we represent them. He feels that if the press would groove more on what it was Grand Funk's audience's experience as the message, and less on just their music or money or troublesome incidents, those bad vibing meetings with the press might not happen. We don't need the press, man, ever, ever. Man, never, says Knight. I never asked the press to print a review of Grand Funk. I never asked for a press to go to a show. As a matter of fact, I refused to give one free ticket. On this whole tour, states Terry, referring to the Summer of '71 tour, the press was uninvited and unwanted, because that was a gathering for Mark and Don and Mel and their people. It was a happy time. We don't want any downs, any bummers, man. We can take care of our own. We don't want the press, the establishment there to lie about it, man, or change it. Although he won't like to admit it himself, Terry Knight is very much aware of his group's media image and thinks about it a lot, how it stands up in comparison with the media images of other groups. For example, he is aware of how pleased everyone was with the initial impression of the Beatles when they came over to the United States. You know, they were breezy, funny, articulate. Their press conferences were entertaining, big news, and everyone came. Terry wants desperately to feel that his press conferences, the one in which Grand Funk finally consented to meet the press after 2 years and told the world it intended to fill Shea Stadium like the Beatles had, would be as big a turning point in getting the railroad loved and as permanent a household word as the Beatles' early exposure had made them loved and well known. Knight would like to be assured of at least some additional tokens of security for his group's unprecedented popularity. It's understandable. No group has ever risen so fast, so high, and yet with a press that has been as generous in its coverage of them as it would be with news of a heat wave in the Sahara Desert. How much longer can it all last? Already there are critics, and there are always critics, who say that Grand Funk is a flash in the pan, that the railroad will disappear down the track, man, that what goes up most likely will come down, and so on. With this in mind, let's listen to some more of Terry's words with regard to how he feels, or perhaps would like to feel, about that press conference. For 2 years, we fought hard to go to that press conference, which one day I hope will be written up as the press conference if somebody ever writes a book on us, man. Because it was a turning point for Grand Funk. Because it gave us more direction, more unity, more oneness, singleness of purpose than anything in the last 2 years. We were laughing hysterically about it in the car afterwards. We can assume that the hysterical laughing, though, was an expression of how the group, suddenly very uptight, if Terry Knight is right, responded to what it all at once realized it was up against in the establishment. Sometimes laughter is the only way one can say anything. But what other reasons are there, besides the possible insecurity of Funk's popularity, which might explain Knight's need to build everything up the way he does? After all, the group is working well, financially set, admired and loved by at least the greater part of its audiences. Part of the answer can be found in what was said earlier about Terry's short taste of fame and how he desired more of it. But there is also Terry Knight's personal motto of, "You can't follow to win," which should be mentioned. You cannot stand in the background and then expect victory to come up to you. Which brings us finally to reveal what Terry Knight actually said to Mark, Don, and Mel during that phone call just after the boys returned from being stranded in New England. He told them in no uncertain terms that there would be no question who the leader would be. "The only thing I demand," said Terry in his typical understated fashion, "is that you do what I say. I'll discuss any decision with you for as long as you want, but afterwards. There are going to have to be a lot of quick decisions, and we won't have time to discuss them ahead of time." Terry justifies his opinion now by pointing out it all has to follow a pattern. It has to fall into place. There haven't been any mistakes with Grand Funk. I made a lot of mistakes early in my life, and I learned from them. So we can begin now to see how deeply the Knight ego is involved with the reception given to Funk anywhere, anytime, and in any way. Even when his motives and behavior are unclear, whether one likes him or not, and there are most emphatically many enemies in Terry Knight's kingdom. One thing you can't help but say about the man is that he is brutally frank and outspoken about his feelings, particularly when they are pissed off feelings. This pissed off side of Terry Knight gets exposed pretty frequently. He reminds one a lot of another non-musical kingpin in the rock world, Bill Graham. Both are serious to the point of absolute humorlessness, are involved in a good number of big bread dealings, possess egos whose capacities for expansion might only be compared to gases found in the hemisphere of other planets, are prone to talk of themselves in the third person, and in general are a pair of very significant movers in the action economics of the counterculture. But to return to Mark Farner and the frustration of trying to be non-violently revolutionary without help from the media, when the press actually asked Mark how he would like to make the world a better place, Farner responded to the questioning reporter, "I would sit down with you and tell you, but it would take a long time because there are a lot of things I want to do, and I have a lot of money to do them with. But one of the things is buy trash cans." Farner quite clearly made a very intelligent decision in offering to talk about his private hopes and plans in a smaller conversation, both for the reasons he gave and because he realized it might be dangerously bad form to reveal too much about himself in front of an already admittedly hostile group of establishment reporters. It was a smart move indeed by the young man, one adequately demonstrating that he's as good handling himself off stage as on. But to find out some of those things Mark is into, we have no recourse at the present time but to rely on Terry Knight. Here's what he has to say about the young man's plans. "Well, I can tell you what they want to do more in depth now, what the press didn't want to hear then, and what Mark has been too uptight because of the tenseness of the situation to follow through on. Right, there's a factory with several thousand rotting, rusty, filthy yellow drums. Mark wants to buy every oil drum this country has got right now. He wants to buy them with his own money and paint them red, white, and blue, man, like it's the color of our country." So far, all we've done mostly is talk about Grand Funk's personal message and personalities, about the group's music apart from everything else. What about that? Where in the history of pop music does the band fit in? We can begin by saying it all goes back to Cream, the Baker, Clapton, Bruce trio that made such beautiful controlled use of volume and fuzz, playing on just drums, guitar, and bass. This supergroup cut the original heavy pattern that was to be cut out and experimented with by other three-piece bands, such as the James Gang and Mountain. Felix Pappalardi, in fact, used to produce Cream before he became the regular bassist for Mountain and a molder of its sound. An interesting thing about the James Gang, and something worth chewing over, is why, when they came up at about exactly the same time as Railroad, were just as loud and emanated a similar type of appeal, did the group never make it anywhere as near as big as Funk. At any rate, what Funk did was to combine the big sound Cream founded with its own Detroit brand of shake-ass Motown soul. One of the Grand Funk's biggest influences and models, as Mel Shasher likes to point out, is Jimi Hendrix. During a conversation with Mel and his girlfriend mentioned before, Shasher stated he would like to be able to emulate Hendrix, to which his girlfriend Dina interjected, "His music, but not his way of life." Dina, by the way, knows that she really hasn't got too much to worry about, because, as Gentle Mel himself admits, "I don't even get to see many groupies anymore. When I do, nothing happens." Anyway, the feeling between Grand Funk and Hendrix is to a large extent reciprocal. According to Terry Knight, who does not feel that his bag needs to be bragging about how many superstars come backstage and want to cut albums with us, himself has admitted that Hendrix, and as a matter of fact at other times John Lennon too, have been backstage to talk to Funk more times than I could count. Once, after the first time Jimi Hendrix had seen the Railroad perform, Jimmy went backstage, sought out Mark, and told him, "Kid, you're out of sight." To anyone who has seen and had the privilege of watching and hearing the late Jimmy perform, the parallel with Mark will be obvious. Both are, or in the tragic case of Jimmy were, solo string musicians with spellbinding qualities of showmanship. Although all of the band's albums are of course gold, most funks will agree that the group's Grand Funk Live album really tells Funk's message like it is best. Somehow it just works. All that live electric energy from Atlanta, Georgia, captured and coming at you from your own phonograph and speaker. As if that alone weren't enough, the record contains performances of most of the band's best-liked cuts. Numbers like Are You Ready?, the blockbuster with which the boys kick off all their concerts. I Need, which includes a rousing guitar solo by Farner. Paranoid, T&UC with that fantastic Don Brewer drum solo with which Don also drove the huge Shea Stadium crowd wild with ecstasy. and Inside Looking Out, possibly the most popular of all Railroad cuts. A 12-minute version of the same number recorded on the Grand Funk album about a drug pusher who gives it all up to start rapping to the brothers and sisters. What this has to do with the revolutionary philosophy of the group, which we discussed earlier, is obvious. Some other of the band's best-known hits from other releases are foot-stomping music, a single release for radio in 2 different time links, one for AM and another for FM, from Railroad's E Pluribus Funk album, I'm Your Captain from the Closer to Home album, People That Stop the War, Heartbreaker, and that unbelievable version of Gimme Shelter from the Gimme Shelter Grand Funk album, which makes the Rolling Stones' own original sound, by comparison, as limp as a Tiny Tim jam with a Muddy Rivers Blues Band, according to some fans. Yeah, we know how that funk brand of rock, how that railroad style of playing shakes, but who does it shake the most? There are a few things that can be said about that. Grand Funk is the first band to really grab the younger teenagers who listen to music as well as the older fans. The young want to be liberated too, spiritually and physically. Funk, in realizing this, is the first band to address this audience, to bring a sophisticated, heavy sound to the really young's ears. And to the young's credit, they're showing themselves ready for it. That bubblegum sound had to go sometime. Everyone who likes to feel likes Grand Funk. Anyone who likes to get juiced up and get the most out of sounds, lights, people, booze, grass, even energy and life vibes of all sorts, like what funk does. As the Railroad shows us in its act, everyone is entitled to feel free. Everyone has the right to feel free and can. One unfortunate consequence of this is that this very comprehension of the Railroad's message can, under some circumstances, be responsible for some of the trouble the boys have had at their concerts. The Anaheim Convention concert in Los Angeles in November '71 was a total sellout. Over 9,000 tickets were sold in advance. When it started, there were almost as many people waiting outside trying to get in. There was some crashing. A number of the disappointed fans who could not get in were a little stoned. The security cops were scared and called the real cops in. They had a little riot. Grand Funk had to promise to play 2 concerts in Munich, Germany in December of '71 during their whirlwind European tour. One to make up for the one they weren't permitted to give the previous year when there had been a ticket sale riot. There have been similar problems in Detroit as well as in Japan. So while other groups might say, I wish we had trouble like that, Grand Funk has nothing but regrets. It's a shame that although the incidents reflect in no way on any members of the group, the band had received a good deal of unjustified bad press because of them. This people-powered Grand Funk seems to evoke everywhere it goes is what has prompted Terry Knight to claim flatly, the establishment is afraid of Grand Funk. We may get a chance to observe more closely the power of this threesome in the future and judge whether it can produce this fear in others. The well-known Maysles brothers, authors of such stunning documentary spectacles as Salesman and Gimme Shelter, the brilliant film of the Rolling Stones' Altamont concert with a fatal stabbing recording, have been traveling with the Railroad and taking footage for the benefit of posterity. If the film comes off, it will be a good thing, because we may not get to see much else of the Grand Funk for some time. According to the latest press releases from Brian Millman, the group's agent, Funk is taking a year hiatus from live performances starting this past December of 1971, the date marking the conclusion of their big European tour. It's for personal reasons, none of which, according to Terry Knight, have to do with internal strife of any kind. Some of the things the boys would like to do is help edit the Funk at Shea TV special, as well as the Maysles Funk on Tour film. It may well be that the band simply wants a rest in order to get its head back together after the expending of too much energy. Grand Funk Railroad Enterprises has also announced that it is in the process of manufacturing cloth pocket patches, necklaces, bottle openers, belt buckles, cufflinks, book covers, stationery, all embossed with E Pluribus Funk design found on the album cover. Maybe the boys will be involved in some of these business-related enterprises during this time. This 6th E Pluribus Funk album, incidentally, cost $50,000 to put together. The actual platter is made of 100% pure virgin vinyl, which means that the vinyl is unprocessed and has never been used. This is a fancy innovation in record production, since most records are made from melted down old albums. Beneath what you are hearing, that means there could be an old cut buried from some song far in the past. In addition, this expensive album has been released on the artist-owned label, an honorary one. Grand Funk is still under contract to Capitol Records. This was just a courtesy extended to the most popular group ever in honor of its 6th gold platter. Incidentally, when Terry Knight married a Swedish model recently, the bride, it is reported, asked for china embossed with E Pluribus Funk as her wedding present. So, now that Grand Funk is dropping from public view, what and how can we find out about them? Here's a possibility. We have here an exclusive conversation, for example, with a man who met the boys under the most informal of circumstances, the only ones we may get to meet the members of the band in, for some time. This is what the unpresuming, unsuspecting traveler had to say about encountering the railroad, from finding himself sitting next to them, just three freaky-looking guys on a long airplane trip from Atlanta to New York. Man, I didn't even know who they were, and they really seemed to dig it too, not being known for a change. We played this long guessing game. I kept guessing things like cactus, mountain, and they would just laugh real hard and drop the candy they were eating on the floor. Really nice human guys, very down to earth, and not at all pretentious. I really liked them. I talked mainly to Mel and Don about music. Mark was a lot more withdrawn. You know, I've got family and friends in show business and know what these people can be like with all that traveling and hassle. These guys were really human and I liked them. Other personal things revealed about the boys come out. I figured they were from the South at first, coming from Atlanta, and that guy Don even had a slight drawl. It turns out that the South is where they first started to hit it big with those monster crowds. They said they really liked Atlanta. Mel and Don seemed to be really good friends and very much into each other's heads, at least on a lot of things. They even have a share in a commune down in Conyers, Georgia. Another quote from another occasion seems to confirm Mel's predilection for the South somewhat, where he says that he enjoys performing down there. Houston, man, that's my favorite. Everybody gets naked and stuff during the concerts. And so the group with the power to drive huge crowds to frenzy so total they begin to take off their clothes is dropping out for a while. Kids get their heads beat in every day, says Terry Knight, but the band that can still show you it's possible to break out of it, man, get away from white socks, skinhead haircuts, and working at the hardware store, that tells you you can be anything you want to be, won't be telling us anything for a while, at least not live. Terry Knight says these kids don't want to hear Mark Farner play his guitar, man. They want to see. That's why the top price tickets go first. The cheapie tickets go first at rock shows, but not with Grand Funk. They want to be close. They want to touch them. They want to see them. What funk fans will do without the opportunity to really see their idols up as close as Terry Knight describes it remains yet to be seen. Will they be waiting impatiently for the return? Will the power still be there when they come back? Sure it will. Bigger than ever.